Welcome to Let's Talk About Love Stories from Everywhere. I'm your host, Jill Ferguson, and today I have an extra special guest with me, someone I've known for probably close to 3 decades, at least 2.5. And when I first met her, her name was Sharry Deszo, and she was on a board that had hired me to work as one of the executives of a nonprofit. And since that time, her last name has changed to Tamborriello, which is quite the mouthful. And I'm just so excited that she's my guest today. Welcome, Sharry.
Thank you. You can call me Sharry. Tamborriello is a huge name.
Well, you, in some ways, you have a huge personality, right? So you can live up to that.
I've been told that. I have been told that.
Yeah.
But we have known each other since the 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has been the 90s. And our relationship has grown and morphed, and it's been a wild ride. In fact, I even officiated your wedding to the current husband.
You did. You did. And then and before that, you married my son. So what can I say?
There is that too.
There is that.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh my goodness.
Where do you live right now?
Right now, I'm in Michigan, a little town called Saline, which is about 20 minutes south of Ann Arbor.
Okay.
Which is lovely because Ann Arbor is a huge area with the University of Michigan there. And so in 20 minutes, we can do anything in the world, because a lot of activity goes on there. And then we can come home to Saline, which is a bedroom community. And in fact, I was laughing at my husband because the day of July 4th, on Friday, I said, it's too quiet. There were no firecrackers. There were no fireworks on the night before or the night of. We did hear one little group about 11 o'clock at night. It was like,
wow. Are they illegal in your town?
No, I don't think so. They were selling them. But I just think that we being a bedroom community is really quiet.
So they're illegal in my city, but people were setting them off anyway.
That's what happened. But anyway, yeah. So that's where I live now. I married Dominic about 8 years ago, and you did marry us. You came here and you married us. That was a wonderful time. Before that, I was married to a wonderful man named John Deszo. And before that, I was married to a man named Neil Hecht, who was the father of my 4 sons. So that's kind of my history there. I went to college. I got a degree in teaching. And then my first opportunity to teach, we were back for my husband's senior year, and we were living in this little basement apartment. And one morning, when I was still in my pajamas, my husband had left for college, there was a knock on my basement door, and I was thinking it was our landlady that lived upstairs. So I just yelled, "Come in." And this man stepped in a suit, tie, the whole works. And he said, "Hi, my name is," I don't remember what his name was, but he was superintendent of a school district in South Dakota, and he wanted me to come and teach for him in a one-room school room.
Wow.
Outside of our little town that we were living in. And I really wanted to do that, except I had just found out I was pregnant with our first kid. And so I told him that. I said, I want to, but I said, I am pregnant. And he said, how long before your maternity clothes? And I said, I'll be in maternity clothes in about maybe 6 months. And he said, that won't do. You women, I hire you and then you get pregnant and then I have to go hire somebody else, because we couldn't teach if we were showing that we were pregnant at that time. And so I didn't get the job.
Thank God times have changed, huh?
Oh, yeah. Thank God, yeah. But anyway, so that was kind of my start. I didn't teach. I became a mother and had the 4 boys. During that time, I became a volunteer, did a lot of volunteer work. Actually, so much that in the 80s, I was Citizen of the Year twice, once for the city I lived in Bellevue, Washington, and then for King TV, which was the big Seattle NBC station.
Uh-huh.
So those were two honors that I had during the 80s for the volunteer work I was doing.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Did you ever regret like not having doing the teaching part or having kids that kind of quickly into the
You know,
marriage?
I didn't, because I really love being a mother. I mean, I really did. I love kids. That's why I went into teaching. And I used my skills. I was a den mother
Mhm.
for not only my sons, but I started when my oldest was 4, because the little boys in the neighborhood, the 6-year-olds, wanted to be Cub Scouts, and none of the mothers would be a den mother. And I said, I'll do it. I was stuck at home anyway. And so I took on 10 little boys who were 8 years old and being a Cub Scout. So I got them all the way through Cub Scouting. And by that time, it was time for my oldest to be in Cub Scouting, and then my next one, and my next one. And then by that time, Andy was coming up, and within a couple of years, he was. So I did, I think, all in all, 12 years of a den mother. I was,
Wow.
you know, so the teaching went, a lot of teaching went
Yeah.
into that, which was
Yeah.
fun. So I did the den mother. I did the Sunday school teacher. Um, I did a lot of things with it, which was fun in my
And it,
life.
and it sounds like you found a lot of fulfillment in volunteering.
I
Right?
did.
Of
I did. I did.
course, it also got you out of the house and
Yeah, part
away
of that,
from
but
full
in the early
time.
days, I was working with the kids, which was really fun. Once they got into school, um, and one of my sons, I found out when he was probably 14, 15, was using drugs. I got into drugs, and I made a career of being in drugs. And so that was,
But you weren't selling or anything. You were doing drug
I,
education.
know, I started out because I was in PTA, and I did a lot of in PTA, because I was 3 years PTA president in the elementary school, then 3 years president in the junior high, and then 3 years president in the high school, and then went on to the state level. And in the state level, we had what they call program action committees.
Mhm.
And it was when I was there that I discovered that I had a kid using drugs. And I went before our state PTA convention, and I said, I am a mother of a child using drugs. And I think we need a program action committee around kids and drugs. I didn't think that we needed to worry about this until our children were in college.
Ah.
And here I am with one of my sons involved, and I want to reach out to other parents. And so we voted on it. We got the program action committee, and then of course I was asked to chair it. And so for 3 years, I chaired a program action committee for the PTA. And during that time, I developed a program to take to parents, which I called the Bonk Show.
Okay.
And from that, it developed into a job. And
Yeah.
I began to charge for it after I got out at PTA. I began to charge for it. People wanted it. I started going around the state with PTAs, and then soon I was doing it for churches. I was doing it for police officers. I went to Austin, Texas, and did it for all of the pharmacists in the United States at the big state convention. I went to Florida and did it for all the attorney generals in the whole United States at their convention. I took it and just went with it as a job, and enjoyed. And I did that for almost 25 years.
So, for someone who trained as an educator, you took your education skills in a different route, probably
Uh,
than you were expecting, and kind of non-traditional, right?
yes,
But what it amazes me that through all of that is it's kind of your love of kids that's really driving your love of volunteering and your volunteer activities and then your paid activities.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Even during the Bong show, I would reach out to the kids, and a lot of them would come with their parents.
Mhm.
I was doing an evening show, and I would tell them, if they wanted to help, to give me a call. And I got a lot of drug paraphernalia that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I even had parents dropping sacks on my front porch of drug paraphernalia that they found. So I had this really great show that
Mhm.
was drug paraphernalia, how they used it, what they did with it, how they hid it. And then I had a drug board that I made out of
Mhm.
contributions, and I had real drugs on it. I had
Yeah.
black heroin in tablets that I had a parent had found and gave to me. I had real cocaine, and when the police department came to my blog show, they had a cow that I was carrying real drugs around on this drug board. And so they volunteered to make me one that was easier to carry and didn't have the real drugs on it.
They had this synthetic.
Yes, they had
Or-
this
Yeah.
synthetic. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so how do you think the legalization of certain drugs has changed?
Well, the drugs have changed.
Okay.
Now
Yeah.
we didn't have fentanyl during that time. We had what we consider the old drugs,
Mhm.
but we didn't have fentanyl, which has changed the whole makeup of
Mhm.
drugs. They lace it with different things, so it has become much more dangerous to use because fentanyl can kill you on the very first
Mhm.
time. Um, I was I was on the fence. Always, people would say, "Should we make marijuana legal?"
Mhm.
And as I matured through this, I began to think, yeah, we really should, because it
Yeah.
it was being used so widely.
Mhm.
Parents were using it, kids were using it. It was like that one. We used to say it was an entry like
Yeah.
alcohol, like cigarettes, um, but it was not that dangerous.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that addictive. And so, towards the end of all of this, I was pretty much pro. Let's make it legal, and then we can handle it. Um, I remember my son. I was in his bedroom one time, and I searched this kid's bedroom. So I got a lot of my drug paraphernalia from him to start with. But I was in his bedroom, and he had this framed leaf, and it had been
Mhm.
on his wall for quite a while. And one day I really looked at the leaf, and I realized that it was a big marijuana leaf. And so I asked him, because he'd gotten really good at just giving me information. In fact, he taught me almost everything I knew at the beginning. I asked him where it came from, and he said, "What came from the plant I grew in your garden?" You know, those kinds of things went into my story for
Uh-huh.
parents, you know. Um, and then I would share their stories. I remember one woman, one time she was in my audience. She stood up and she said, "Let me tell you what happened to me." She said, "One day, 10 o'clock in the morning, I was knocking on my door. It was the police. And they said, we were just driving through the neighborhood, and wondered if you knew that you had drug paraphernalia on your rooftop. You have pots of marijuana." And she said, "On my roof? Oh, no, of course not. What?" And they said, "Come with us." And they took her down about a half a block, and they said, "Now look at your house." And on top of her roof, which was kind of flat at that point, were all these pots of marijuana. She's my son was doing this. I was like, so people would call, kids
Yeah.
would call. I got a lot of kids into treatment, which was a part of my really satisfying part of the Bong Show, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Helping out the parents and helping out the kids too,
Yeah.
so that they don't end up with addictions and
True.
or if they did have an addiction that they got
They
over.
knew where to go and how to
Yeah.
get help. Yeah.
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 Yeah. A lot of stories. I may have to write a book too.
Yeah, well, I think that's not a bad idea, but
I have a person that could help me do that.
Okay. So you mentioned 3 different husbands, right?
Yeah.
Uh, how did okay,
I divorced.
you
I
divorced the first
divorced.
one. Yeah,
I did. I divorced the first one. Um, that one was 29 years of marriage.
yeah.
And it was a case where we never should have married, but we married very young. I was 20 and he was 22.
Mhm,
And we just weren't old enough. And it came to the realization that we had very little in common.
mhm.
Um, he didn't want children. I didn't know that, but he did not want children. And in
And you
fact,
had 4
me that
anyway.
after I had four, he told me that. Um, we were different. We were different religions. We were totally different in politics. He was definitely a Republican. I was definitely a Democrat. It was, so we didn't have a whole lot in common. Um, and he was an engineer, and people who have married engineers would kind of know about tunnel vision engineers, and he was very much that way. So his idea of being a father was he brought home the money,
Mhm,
and I did everything else. I mowed the lawn, I took care of the house, I took care of the children. I took him
mhm,
to the doctor. I took him to the hospital. That was my job. His job was pretty much just to take care of the work and bring
mhm,
home the paycheck, um, and go to some of their games here and there, But pretty much everything else was
mhm.
my job, um, and I decided I wanted more. I wanted more.
Yeah.
So I made a decision. The youngest one,
Can
5.
can I
Yeah,
interrupt for 1 second there? I feel like saying you wanted more was a sign of some self-love.
yeah, probably. Probably. Yeah, self-love for sure.
Yeah,
Take care of me finally.
yeah.
I had spent 29 years taking care of everyone else
Mhm,
and enjoying it. Those were my
yeah,
volunteer years. Those were bringing up the kids' years. Um, but then I realized that I didn't do much self-love. There were
mhm,
things I wanted for me that I wasn't going to have.
yeah.
I got out of that marriage, and so that's what I did. Yeah,
And then you were with, I think, probably one of the great loves of your life.
I was.
Yeah. In fact, I've heard you refer to him as that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Um, he happened to be a neighbor. Um, and I was in the middle of divorcing Neil, and he stepped away from his wife and called me one day and said, "I'd like to take you to dinner." And I said, "Oh, we can't possibly do that. Our kids." He had um, 4 boys
Mhm.
and a girl, and they were the same ages within 6 months of my boys, and they all played together. It was like,
Yeah.
and they slept. We had sleepovers with him. It was like, oh no, we can't possibly do that. The neighborhood would talk. I'm in the middle of my divorce. Now you're separated. No. And he said, "Well, what about lunch?" And I said, "Oh, the lunch would be fine." It wasn't that scary, you know. And so basically, we just began to see one another. Yeah.
Yeah.
And 5 years later, it was 5 years before
Uh-huh.
we married, but we finally married. And yes, he was truly the love of my life.
Yeah.
Not that the husband I'm
Yeah.
with now isn't very much, he's very much like him in many ways. Dominic and John are very much alike. But
So
yeah,
John was also an engineer too.
he was. He was a mechanical engineer.
Yeah.
He did a lot of really interesting jobs. Uh, Boeing built a jet foil, which was a passenger boat on jet,
Mhm.
foil. So it rode above the water, and he was a captain for that. And then he went to many different countries training other captains when they sold the boats
Mhm.
to a country. That was his favorite job. He also worked to put the man on the moon, and he was at every testing, every firing during those years. Um, it turned out that he was working in Alabama when I was living in Alabama, because my first husband Neil, was working on the same thing, and our two oldest kids went to the same preschool,
But you
but
hadn't met.
we never
Yeah.
met. We never met. it
Not
was,
until you were all in Seattle?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
So
amazing.
that was John. Yeah.
Yeah,
He was a gentle giant, a beautiful man, and very loving, very caring. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, he passed away with Alzheimer's, and you were very much a part of that because
Yeah.
you were my ear, you were my staunch supporter during those years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's just, I mean, that was my first experience with somebody that I was close to having Alzheimer's
Yeah.
and saying goodbye for so long,
Uh,
right? Watching
yeah.
the stages of that and
Yeah.
the
Almost 9 years.
the
Almost 9 years.
person going through getting frustrated because they understand that they don't know things anymore, and
Yeah.
then
Psychotic break.
moving
Yeah.
past that, right?
Yeah.
Where you don't know, you know, you that you knew things before.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just so difficult on everybody around, in addition to the person going through it.
It is. It is a horrible disease of loss,
Mhm.
and the loss goes on and on and on. Um, and I told people, I said, it's like they're here, and then they have um, some kind of attack, and their behavior drops down, and then that's kind of over with, and they come back a little, but they never get back up here. And so it's a step downward, step downward, step downward, um, as they lose so much. Yeah.
Mm.
And that became a full-time job for me during
Yeah.
those years. Um, I kept him at home as long as I could.
Mhm.
And then he became violent, and he would have these episodes of howling and hitting. And I would lock myself in the bathroom until he would settle down, and he would come and knock on the door and say, I'm sorry, when he was back, you know, and then we go through it again. And finally, it was time, and we put him in a Alzheimer's home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that you have to get to a point where you need to protect yourself, right?
For me, that,
And protect him so that he's
yeah,
with people that are able to help him not hurt himself too.
yeah, indeed, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so uh, last week for the Let's Talk About Love magazine, I wrote an article about how sometimes love, we like to think of love and all the like flowery, gushy feelings that we go through, right? But
Yeah.
sometimes love has to be tough, and it has to say goodbye, and it has to let
uh,
go.
Yeah.
and and that's also a really powerful part of love besides the gushy stuff, right? That this is part of life, it's part of the way we deeply 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 love. And it reminds me of, you and I have a similarity where when we were both going through our divorces at very different times, right, in our lives, but we both ended up needing hysterectomies. And
Yeah.
then you were going through all that stuff with John, and at the very end of it, it broke your heart so much. I would venture to say that you ended up with breast cancer.
3 months later after his death. Yeah.
And, and I have other friends who have gone through divorces and gone through the same thing with the breast cancer, where it's like, here's our heart chakra, and we're blocking it with all this
Yeah.
emotion,
Yeah.
um, and grief.
Yeah.
And it's affecting like our intimacy chakras, or it's affecting our heart chakras, and it ends up causing physical disease, right?
Indeed.
That's
Yeah, it really does. I've always been very positive that that's what happened to me,
yeah,
was that there was so much bottled up grief because you don't have time to grieve.
not
Um,
when you're caretaking
not when you're
24/7. Yeah,
you know, I think the biggest time I had of grieving was when I put him in the Alzheimer's
yeah,
home. I would come home and I would literally howl with pain. And I think that went on for weeks. I would go up every day and see him and feed him for lunch. And then I'd go back up in the evening and feed him for dinner and stay with him till he went to bed. I did that every single day for 16 months. But when I come home, the grief would hit me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Still,
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So literally had a yelling time with God.
Mhm.
And it was just before Christmas in 2014. And I said to God that day, yelling, if you don't take him, I will. I'll give you 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And then I'm taking him out of this world. He was so bad. He was digging holes, scratching. He had gone into so much psychotic breaks. A whole long story. But anyway, I knew he had to leave. He had to leave. And so I just promised God that if he didn't do it, I was going to do it. And I had talked to some friends, and I kind of knew how I could do it and hopefully not get caught. Um, and on just right after New Year's Day, a Friday, he was showing signs of what we thought was the flu. And so the nurse and I decided it was time maybe to have him checked out at the ER. So I called a nurse ambulance and took him to the ER. Mm-hmm. And they said, no, it's not the flu. It's not the flu. But we're going to keep him overnight. And so, long story short, they did a MRI on him, and they said, there's not much going on in this brain anymore. But we're going to hold him one more night. And that night, I had a cot pulled into the hospital room for me. So I was staying there around the clock. And that night, I tucked him all in and did our little system where he hugged he loved to hug a pillow. And so he was hugging his pillow. And I gave him the 3 kisses I always gave him on his face. And I said good night. And I turned off the light and went to bed. And it was a couple hours later, and all of a sudden this thing hit me, woke me up. I got up and I turned on the light, and it was a pillow. And John was awake and his eyes were twinkling like he used to, and he's laughing. And I said, did you throw this pillow at me? And he's laughing. And so I went back over and I did the routine again. He gave me back the pillow. I said, now you go to sleep. And I went back, turned off the light, crawled into bed, and I thought, now I'm going to check on him. So I had a little pinpoint flashlight, turned it on, looked over there, and the pillow's up in the air, and he's all ready to throw it again. And finally I got him settled down. But that was the old John. That was the John I loved.
Yeah.
And the next day, he went into a semi-coma, and he never woke up again. The following day, they told me he was only working on the very basic of the brain. And I said, I'll get hospice. We'll take him back to where he's being cared for. I've had a cot brought in, and I stayed there round the clock with him for 8 days when he passed, and he never woke up again. But when I would talk to him, he would squeeze my hand.
Yeah.
So there was something,
Yeah.
But I felt such relief and then guilt, But I thought, oh, it's such a relief for him and for me. And so I kind of tried to help other people going through this to understand that we reach a point where it's so bad that the only thing that is going to be good is for them to pass.
Yeah.
And
and isn't that the ultimate form of love almost?
I think so.
Because if he was cognizant of his behavior, he would have been mortified by it, because that's not who he was.
Yeah. No. So yeah, this is that disease. You live through it. There's still, I said, there's still that love pain of losing him, but there's also the knowledge that I'll see him again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then to find love again, which is just, I had decided now.
When you were a little bit older.
Yeah, a little older. And I had joined a singles club in Seattle, which was really great for 55 or older. They did all kinds of activities. It was really fun. We walked on Saturdays. We went to plays. We had dinners out. It was really, really great. And I dated with some of the guys there, and I told them, I'm not, don't look at me for marriage. I'm never marrying again.
Yeah.
And then I met Dom, and everything went out the window. And I remarried at 77, I think it was 77. Yeah. And here we are.
And not only did you remarry at 77, but you married a guy who's 11 years younger than you.
That's true. And that's the only way to do it, girls. Hey, I mean, yeah, it keeps you young, keeps you young. So I'm 86 now, and life is good. Life is good.
Yeah.
And I tell people, you keep moving, you keep active, you keep involved, and life can be really good.
I have a friend and a client who I co-authored a book with, who's 96, and her husband died back in the 80s, early 80s, and she had not dated much at all after that. And last year, she got a boyfriend for the first time since her husband.
And how old we are.
and she just is so excited that she has found, a companion. And, she hasn't exactly said if she's in love with him, so I won't put those words in her mouth. But
she's fond of him,
probably. Somebody to watch TV with and have her meals with. And she's just thrilled. And he's also younger than she is, and his wife had passed on. And and so I think that people can find love at any age, or companionship at any age, affection at any age.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah.
Love has no limits and no age on it at all. Yeah. And not at all.
Yeah.
It's a good life. But I have been extremely fortunate in that I've had 3 marriages, one not the best, but a lot of lessons, a lot of love, and 4 beautiful sons from that one. And then 2 of deeply loving men who really are gems, both of them, And my husband today, 11 years younger. Yeah. We just finished working out just before I came on this with you. And we're going to get ready to go walk the dog in a little bit. And, it's
well, and you work. I mean, that just amazes me, right? That you go to the gym, you work out with a personal trainer a few times a week. I think it keeps you in the shape that you're in. Keeping up your strength is so important. I was in a wellness clinic at a CEO conference back in April. And the doctor there said that starting at age 40 is when you start to rapidly lose muscle mass as a male or a female, but starting in the 40s. And so it's so important to keep doing things that maintain strength. Yeah. And as you get even older, that's even more important.
Indeed.
Right? Because that's how people fall and break hips and do all those other things.
Exactly. I work a lot on balance. I work a lot on balance, Yeah.
What's your favorite kind of working out to do? I mean, I know years ago you used to kayak, but exercise.
The exercise that I do, a lot of it's balance work. I do strength work. Gosh, I do so many things because he puts me through my paces for an hour. So I do a lot of leg work, strengthening my legs. I do band work, so I'm doing, lifts and butterflies or whatever. I mean, all kinds of things with his help with the bands. And like I say, I work on the balance several times during the time. I do sit-ups. I do marching, which is you do it backwards, the length of the gym.
Wow.
And, you pick a spot, you walk backwards, and then you walk forwards, and then you walk backwards again in a marching step, which is really strengthening, but it's also balance.
Yeah.
When you're going backwards. So I do all kinds of things during that period. I'm with. And then during the week when I'm not there, we're in a condo. So it's a flight of stairs down to do the laundry, a flight of stairs up to the bedroom, which is great because I'm doing stair steps all day
Yeah.
long. We walk the dog. I do a little gardening. I just, so I keep up my movement. I just, I walk with the dog. I walk with Dom, and just kind of strengthening stuff all day long. Yeah.
It's one of your grandchildren sent me a message a week ago and said, "I need some advice on what products I should use on my skin and how you and my grandmother, you,
Oh, I know who it was. Yeah.
stay in great shape."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just thought that was, I mean, it was such a compliment for her to ask those questions. And she just said, like, Grandma Sharry has such beautiful skin. And she's like, and so I need to learn all the tricks I can now because I'm 30 and need to figure it out.
I know. I got the same message, and
Yeah.
it tickled me no end, and it really helped me to put things down on a text message back to her,
Yeah.
about and basic things, moisturizing, making sure you're cleansing your face,
Absolutely.
it's not about. I've never had a facelift.
Yeah.
This is all natural. I stopped
Mhm.
dyeing my hair when I turned 80. I said enough. Let's see what it looks like. And the guy that does my hair, he said, "Wow, don't ever touch this. Look
Yeah.
at you." You
It
know,
looks great.
yeah. And so, but I told her all that's natural.
Yeah.
People say, what have you done? Like maybe a facelift, and I said, I was very lucky that I had parents who were very young looking,
Yeah.
and that's it. I mean, I haven't done. I do a few things. I moisturize. I do stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't do
A
anything.
little red light therapy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, a little. And I haven't done that, Jill, since I moved here.
Oh.
I bought it with me, and then you told me you were doing it, and I thought, where is mine? I found it. I found it out. I'm going to go back and start it again.
Yeah. You used to do that while you watch TV or a movie.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
here I
That was even way before it became like super in vogue.
yeah, yeah. No, and that helps lift. But, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
All that self-care, self-love.
yeah. And that's what I sent back to our darling Shanny. Yeah.
But the other thing that I think though is that helps you look healthy, right, is to have joy and feel fulfillment in your life and to have love in your life. Because I
I
think if we feel miserable, it shows up on our faces and shows up
oh,
on our skin and in our bodies.
um, I was in a situation on Sunday that tickled me no end. We were at a luncheon with dear friends of ours who are 40 years younger than we are.
Okay.
And that tells you something about
Mhm.
us and them. But anyway, so we went to the luncheon, and you always bring stuff, and all of
Uh-huh.
that. And there were probably 15 or 20 people there when we arrived, which is always fun. And so we sat down at this table, and Don saw somebody over there, and so he was over there. And I was sitting at this table with their two sons who are in college, talking to them. And there was this woman sitting just beyond them at the table, looking at me and looking at me. And so finally I said, "I don't think you and I have met." And
Mhm.
she said, "I'm coming over there." So she comes around, pulls up a chair. She was in her 70s, mid 70s, maybe. And she said, "I saw you the minute you walked in, and I thought, I need to know this woman." And she sat there with me, and we talked for over an hour or an hour and a half.
Mhm.
She was just like, and she took my phone number. She said, "I want to call you. I want to stay in touch with you." She said, "You're the person I've been looking for." You know,
That's a lot of pressure.
I know, but it was like, um, she said to me, she said, "You're what I want to be. You know, you're what I want to be when I'm your age. I want the story. I want to know what you
Uh,
do." You know, and
yeah.
she was very young looking. I mean, she didn't look like she was 77, but anyway, it was really fun for me. And I gave her my phone number, and she gave me her phone number, and we're going to have lunch. And, whatever. But that it just
It never hurts to make more friends
no,
at
never.
any age.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it
Do-
doesn't hurt to have people say, you're where I want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite quote about love or anything like that?
Oh my goodness, sweetheart. I have a poet for a husband, right?
Yeah.
And I have had so many love poems from him that are so good. I wish you'd asked me earlier.
That's
But
okay.
I don't have
Yeah.
one right here, right now.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Um, but yeah, there's so many of
If you could give advice to anybody younger or even older, right, that is about love, self-love, relationships, what would you say? What would you have wanted to know as your younger self?
I would like to know more about self-love.
Yeah.
I didn't have a lot of that. I mean, given my age, this was the 50s. Um, uh, One of the things that I teach talking with younger people is particularly women. I said, you don't always have to be nice. We were brought up, and I think girls still are being do some of this to be nice.
Mhm.
Be polite, be nice. No, you don't
Yeah.
argue. Da, 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 da. And I realized about the time I hit 45, maybe 50, I didn't have to be nice anymore. Um, I tell people that, and they look at me and I said, doesn't mean you have to be mean,
Yeah.
but you learn that you can speak out, that you can say, no, I think differently than that. And this is what I think.
Yeah.
And
So
I
what you're talking about isn't being mean. It's like setting boundaries. It's being willing to state your viewpoint,
where
right?
you are.
Yeah.
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 Um, and my husband now, Dom, laughs because he said, you always did that.
Yeah.
And his story that he loves about me is when I sat down with my first husband and we were seeing the minister just before we got married, right? And he was going over the vows and all of this. And he said, so you will love, honor, and obey. And I said, no. Now this was 1959. I said, no. And he said, what do you mean, no? I said, I will not obey. He said, what do you mean you won't obey? I said, I will not obey anyone. And I will not promise to obey my husband. And he said, you have to. And I said, no, I don't. And I said, if you put obey in my wedding, I will say no. And he was horrified, but he didn't. He substituted something else. And I don't know what he substituted. I just was listening for the word obey, ready to say no, And so my husband said, you were 20. You were already doing it.
Yeah, and you were a feisty redhead from the
Yeah,
beginning. So
that's true. The red, always blame it on having the red hair. But,
yeah.
so I want women to feel that way and be able to say it, you know? Um, and I think women today are more willing to do that, which is wonderful to see. I think more and more women are standing up for themselves, are saying what they believe, and it can be counter to what their parents believe, and that's okay. Parents may be angry about it, but that's their problem. You don't have to, you know, you don't have to always be nice and sweet. You can say no.
Yeah.
You can say I don't agree,
Yeah.
you know, and that's a whole part of being a woman. And you can still love. I say to people, you don't have to be mean about it. You can say it lovingly, but you can
Yeah.
say, yeah. So I think for the young girls today, um, first of all, they have so much more than I had in the way of opportunities.
Yeah.
Um, and I had a young woman in my neighborhood here the other day that I was talking to, and she said, "What did you really want to be?" And I said, "A pilot," but that wasn't open to me.
Yeah.
I said, I could be a school teacher, I could be a nurse,
Yeah.
or I could be a secretary.
Yeah.
That was pretty much it.
Yeah.
And I said, "And today you can be an astronaut. Today you could be a pilot, I mean, yeah.
It's funny you say that because one of my grandmothers was 1/3 owner of a construction company, and everybody thought she was the secretary of the construction company, and that the two males were the ones that owned the
Of
construction
course,
company, and that was not the
of course.
case.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No.
um,
So she
yeah,
was ahead. That's why you are what you are,
yeah,
dear. Yeah.
yeah. That's funny.
It-
Thank
yeah.
you. And if any of our viewers want to reach out to you and say hi or comment, what's the
Yes.
best way to do that? I know you're on Facebook.
I'm on Facebook, but probably texting. Uh,
Oh, well, you don't want to give your phone number to
well, that's
uh,
right. Yeah.
look on it.
I didn't think about that, but yeah,
Yeah,
maybe not the phone number.
yeah,
Uh, so yeah, I think probably Facebook would be
yeah,
good.
yeah.
Because I check that, you
And that's
know.
one of your public facing
Yes.
things
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
So good. Yes. Let's do that.
Okay. Well,
I have
thank you.
I have to remind myself several times, not to get too too open for
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah, there can be downsides to that.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say?
I don't know, sweetheart. I think it's been
Yeah.
so much fun to do this with you.
Well, that's good.